and welcome to Staff Picks, the podcast for movie nerds by movie nerds. As always, I'm Mario Lanza, and I will be your host in our journey to discover and delve into some of the more underloved, underrated movies that are floating around out there. Today's movie is an especially interesting one for this show because this is not one that you would expect someone with my odd, eclectic taste to really be into. We'll be talking about a very sensitive, gentle movie from 1977 called Oh God, starring the wonderful combination of George Burns and John Denver. And again, this is not a movie you'd expect me to have on the show, but it's one that I really feel very strongly for, and it'll be interesting as we delve into that. And I will introduce my guest here. My guest here today on today's podcast, she is a very well-known pop culture guru, internet writer, just a big fan of pop culture in general, mystery science theater fan like me. You may know her from Rob Has a Podcast. This is the first time we've ever done a podcast together. Please welcome Jessica Liese.
Hi, Mario. I'm super psyched to be here.
Oh, yeah. This is going to be a fun one because, as Jessica and I kind of discussed before we went on the air here, this movie is one that's it walks the fine line on being in good taste or being outright blasphemy. And you have two people here who are not especially religious. They're going to try to delve into this one. So we will be skating the line of getting in trouble, I think, quite finely on this episode.
Yeah, well, I think we're gonna have a great debate here on whether it actually ever does kind of veer into that blasphemous territory, because I'll tell you, I grew up in a household that was regular churchgoers and very religious, and whenever this movie was on, my parents actually loved that I was so into it.
Wow.
My very religious parents thought it was great that there was this sweet, sentimental movie about God, and I was super into it, so...
So they were not against the idea that God could take human form and show up in a movie. They were fine with that?
Yeah, they were fine with it. I think the overall message is pretty positive. And, you know, they never actually take his name in vain if you think about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's surprising how tasteful this movie is and how I'm not saying it's controversial. It's very much pro-faith, pro the idea of there being a God, but it does dump on organized religion quite blatantly. And it's one of those that I grew up in a super religious household. My dad was super Catholic, like to the extent that my grandparents, when they go to Mass as a kid, it couldn't be in English. It had to be in Latin. Like, this is the hardcore Catholicism that I grew up with. And then on the other side, my grandfather on my mom's side was the president of the Lutheran Layman's League, like the president of the church. So, like, I come from about as religious a background as you can get, kind of getting it hit from both sides. And this is a movie that would not have been encouraged in my house just because it would have been a little dicey on some of the theology, I think.
Yeah, it definitely is. There are some things in it that don't exactly conform to anything you would have been taught in a formal Sunday school, although I have to wonder, growing up half Catholic and half Protestant, there was like one capital T theology for you?
No. Okay, here's the rule, and my parents are not around anymore, bless their hearts, so I can say this. I could not say this when they were alive, but the rule was my dad kind of took the lead in church. We would go to Catholic church, we'd be baptized, we'd go to Sunday school, First Communion, but if Dad got lazy and stopped taking us to church on a regular basis, which he was known to do, then we had to go to Lutheran church with my mom, which was way worse because it was like way longer. So that was how it was. So the Catholic was the thing, the Lutheran was the punishment, and I did not want to go to the Lutheran one, which generally involved a 3-hour potluck with the entire city afterwards.
That sounds like the Lutheran church that I grew up in.
Okay, so let me hear about your backstory with this movie. How did you get it introduced to it? Is it something you grew up with? How did we end up here, the two of us, snarky pop culture people, talking about a movie this gentle and sensitive?
Well, I have a soft spot for anything that is earnestly presented, and I think that's pretty obvious in my musical tastes and my literature tastes, and this movie was something that I stumbled on by accident in the 80s when I was a child, and it was around the dawn of the Encore Network, which was a pay channel that came in your cable package shortly after we got cable. This movie network came up, and it was like $1 a month, so my parents decided it was worth it. And they touted themselves as the best movies of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And there was a lot of stuff on there that they would air it relentlessly. Whatever they got was always on. And this was one of those movies that was, every time you turned the TV on, it would be on. And I just kind of pick it up midstream and enjoy it. And again, my parents thought this was very wholesome. It was better than watching like R-rated movies. It's pretty much if Disney put it out, I was allowed to watch it. And other than that, they'd have to vet it. But this seemed pretty harmless, and they let me watch it. And so I watched it an awful, awful lot, to the point where I ended up, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this later on, but I ended up tracking down the sequels, and we would rent them on VHS tapes from the video store. And I rented Oh God, You Devil probably 4 or 5 times. But the OG Oh God, as it were, is really the best of the 3 and the most fun. And of course, George Burns is this guy that if you grew up, I think around the time that you and I did, Mario, you're a few years older than I am, but you don't know George Burns as his vaudeville personality with Gracie Allen. You know him as a guy whose entire shtick was around being old and cranky and snarky.
Yeah, and that's something I hope to get across to a lot of my younger listeners. You may not even know who George Burns is, so I'll just kind of give a quick summary. He was this guy, very famous vaudeville comedian. He was part of a husband and wife team. They were Burns and Allen with his wife, Gracie Allen, and they were an interesting pair. This was back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, I would assume. I kind of forget, but it was interesting because he was the straight man in the act, and she got to do all the punchlines, and that was kind of reversed for the typical comedian husband-wife team of the era, that the husband would always do the punchline. So he would always give the punchlines to Gracie. She became a big star. He was always her straight man, and then she died, and that was kind of his legacy for many years. He was just this old guy who was madly in love with Gracie. He had the big romance of all time. She died, and then he was just a single guy. And then later he somehow had a second career as an actor, and it started in a movie called The Sunshine Boys, where he won an Oscar. And then this was his second movie, Oh God, and he just rocks in this movie. There's no other way to. Would you agree with that? He just owns this movie.
Oh yeah, he's really. I think it's his time to shine. He's not the straight man in this one, and he just really takes the part and runs with it. And he's got such a great delivery on some of these lines that this is one you do have to watch a few times, because there's so many quick little moments that you watch and you're not going to catch them the first time around. And just like every time somebody invokes the name of God, he reacts to it, which I think is hilarious. And it's kind of stupid and kind of quick, and like at the point where John Denver's character Jerry says thank God, and he just says you're welcome real quick. The delivery on these lines is everything, and he nails it every single time.
Yeah, and it's very similar to like Leslie Nielsen. Leslie Nielsen, for people who don't know, was a very, very serious villain actor. And then all of a sudden he got a renaissance at the end of his career because of the movie Airplane, where he's a funny guy, and every movie after that he was a funny guy. And that's really George Burns. He was God in like every movie until he died, and it was just amazing. And yeah, it's the oddest thing, because again, I grew up super religious just like Jessica did. I lapsed, and for me it wasn't like a simple lapse, like I just don't believe in this. For me it was really, I get to college and I'm like, well, okay, I don't have to do that crap anymore. And I remember being shocked in college that my friends were still going to church and service. And I'm like, we don't have to do that. Our parents aren't here. Like that was the extent of my thinking. I'm like, I don't have to do this anymore. But yeah, like George Burns plays such a likable, sensitive, just like a charming God you'd like to hang out with. And he just makes everything he says make such rational sense, where you think, this is how religion should work, and this is such an appealing view of religion. And that's the thing I really like about this movie and why it jumps out at me, is that it's like it just presents this very theistic view that I think would appeal to anybody.
Well, I think you nailed it right there. It is really, I think this is, and I have not read the novel on which the movie is based. It's by a gentleman named Avery Corman, whose other big novel, Kramer versus Kramer, was also made into a critically acclaimed movie. But I think the source material had to have originated as someone thinking about, well, if I could sit down with God, what would I want him to say to me? What would I want that guy to be like? Mm-hmm. I'd want him to have a little gentle sense of humor, and I'd want him to tell me that everything can be okay, which is the central message that God brings in this film. He says it can work. And he doesn't say, it's all going to be okay, and says that everybody comes together and is okay to each other, then things are probably going to turn out fine. And I think it's such I think I keep going back to this word, but it's such a gentle view of how the world, how you would want the universe to work. And it doesn't rely on one message being right and another one being wrong. And it's just such a great way of presenting everything. And I think that's what appealed to it for me as well. Like growing up in this kind of, where I was already, even as a little kid, questioning, like, okay, but why do we go to this church and not that church? And why do we believe in this God and not the one that people on the other side of the world believe in? Why are these things the correct things to believe? And then you have this movie where God comes in and essentially says the only correct thing to believe is that you all have to be nice to each other, and it's going to be okay. And that, I think, I responded to as a child, and watching it again now, I responded to it equally as positively. I just don't have a bad thing to say about the way that faith is portrayed in this movie.
Yeah, and you almost think watching this movie now, like, I would really love to see a movie like this come out now in today's climate and today's era, where basically the message is just, hey, everybody chill out and just be nice to each other. Like, and it's such a simplistic way to view religion, but again, it's just so appealing.
Yeah, I can't even imagine what that would look like if it got remade now. Like half of everybody would be boycotting it and saying it was evil without even seeing it, of course. Like, everything is so polarized now.
Yeah.
Also, who could they get? Like, I think you can't make this movie without George Burns.
Okay, what's interesting, do you know who they originally wanted to play God when they wrote this movie? I just read this today.
I have not heard this.
Mel Brooks.
Well, that I could see. Yeah. Yeah, I can see, because I think some of the critical reception that I read about this was that it felt very much like an extension of Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks's 2,000-Year-Old Man sketches, that I could definitely see this being geared toward him, because it is very much that tone of humor.
Yeah, it would have been a little more shticky. And it would have been very tough coming off the combination of Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein, saying, "Oh, that's the guy that's going to play God." Oh, I'm sure that won't offend anybody. But I do think that there maybe isn't an equivalent of George Burns now. Although saying that, of course, we've had other God movies like Bruce Almighty, where you have Morgan Freeman as God. I guess that would probably be the ideal choice. And again, maybe that's because he's already played God. I don't know if I'm really saying anything all that extraordinary.
No, I guess not. The movie that I think of when I think about other movies in this idiom is Defending Your Life, actually, which is another one of my all-time favorite movies that doesn't get enough love, because I think it does kind of take that same ecumenical tack where you think about how you would like things to be and just kind of build your world around that. And I think it does the same thing very well in this sort of sweet, sentimental way.
You know what's hilarious is the #1 movie people have requested I do on Staff Picks is Defending Your Life. So that is an excellent observation, to the point that my birthday was actually on Sunday, and my wife saw how many people were requesting it, and she bought me a copy of it. So it will be coming soon as an episode.
Well, that's great. I think it makes a lovely companion piece to Oh God, and I think if you're looking for a double feature some night and you want some like quiet, sentimental worldview in your life, I think you could do a lot worse than these two.
A little chicken soup for the soul, if you will.
Yes.
Okay, let's walk through the plot of this movie. We've kind of beat people over the head with discussion. I haven't even mentioned what this movie is about. For people who don't know, this movie came out in 1977, and it's a very simple plot. It's really God comes down from heaven and reveals himself to an assistant manager at Food World? Where does he work? Food World, yeah. John Denver plays a assistant manager at a grocery store. God presents himself one day to him, and he says, yeah, you're going to be my new Moses. I want you to go out and spread the word. Just tell people that I exist. Tell people that I'm watching, and everything can be okay. It can all work out down here. Just let people know that I'm watching, and you guys need to be nice to each other. And it's basically a sitcom from that point of Jerry not believing at first and then slowly accepting it and finally being branded as crazy as he's going around telling newspapers, talk shows, and eventually a famous preacher that, God is telling me this, he's giving me all these messages, and no one believes him. And it's really it sounds more slapsticky than it is. It's really not. It's really a very gentle movie, really just with two actors, George Burns, again, who had barely done any movies, and then John Denver, who, for people who don't know, was a singer. He was maybe the most famous singer of his era, and this was his first big movie. So it's kind of two novice actors, and it just kind of catches lightning in a bottle that the dialogue is so well written and well thought out, and it's just such a, I keep saying gentle, just a gentle, thoughtful movie that it wins you over despite the fact that it shouldn't on paper. It's a weird movie, but it just does.
Yeah, well, we've talked a lot about George Burns in this role, but I think John Denver was a big surprise because he hadn't really acted up until this point. Like I think they'd seen him interplay with some Muppets at this point, but he'd never done a dramatic role, and to see him he's really the perfect choice for this character because this character is like the John Denver of movie characters. He's very inoffensive, and that's kind of the reputation that I think John Denver's music has. It's like, it's not pushing any boundaries. It's not, assistant manager at Food World is kind of the perfect occupation as well. It's just like, this guy really has never offended anybody. He doesn't have a mean bone in his body, but he's also not, he's not the most virtuous and the most godly person you're ever going to meet. He admits he's not religious, but he's very average. He's just like a composite of everybody.
Yeah.
And this is why he's chosen. And the perfect blend of kind of incredulity and resignation that John Denver brings to it, I think, is kind of overshadowed because he's so frequently upstaged by George Burns.
Yeah. And again, George Burns would pretty much upstage anybody. But yeah, I've read reviews of this, and it's funny, when this movie first came out, a lot of the reviews kind of trash John Denver, saying, well, he's clearly not an actor. But again, for people who don't know John Denver, he did this really gentle Americana kind of country music at the time. Thank God I'm a Country Boy, stuff like that. Really gentle songs. And yeah, it's really hard to picture anybody else playing this role in this movie, and it's the weirdest thing, because I think I read he never even really did another movie after this. This is the only script he ever wanted to do, he ever liked. And I was actually listening to the DVD commentary the other day where, like, Terry Garr was on there. Terry Garr ends up playing his wife, and she was like, he was so good, and like they all just fell in love with him. And even George Burns, like notoriously kind of prickly, just like an old stickler vaudeville guy, even eventually realized how good John Denver was at just reacting to stuff and just the cadence of lines. And I think the director of this movie, Carl Reiner, said the same thing. He said John Denver had such an ear for lyrics and words that he was constantly like rewriting dialogue or making suggestions, and it always made sense because he just had a way with how conversations and words worked, and that he was amazing for a first-time actor. So it's like you said, he gets overshadowed by George Burns, and he really shouldn't, because I think he's really quite astounding for what minimal acting experience he had going into this.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't called upon to be King Lear in this, but he knew exactly what needed to be brought to the role, and he brought it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's all. And yeah, that's in the DVD commentary. That's one thing that Carl Reiner, the director of the movie's on there, and the writer was, and they keep saying that over and over. This movie's simple. It does exactly what it has to do and no more. And one thing, I don't know if you noticed this, they really pound on it in the commentary, that there's almost no music in this movie. It's really just like a stage play. It's just two characters talking in a scene. And like they'll just let these scenes go on endlessly of characters talking and talking about ideas and theology and faith and stuff. And Carl Reiner mentions that in the commentary, like they would never do a movie this way anymore, because they would have to have special effects around God, make him glow. They'd have more comedy. They'd have wacky music, and like there's almost no music in this movie. It's like watching a play.
Yeah, it did occur to me watching it this week that it did feel very much like a play, just because the minimal cast. And I think there were a lot of movies in the 70s and early 80s that were adapted from stage plays kind of hastily. And so you do see the seams. And I was kind of shocked to find out that this had never been a stage play up to that point, because it did have that same kind of feel to it, where it felt like they'd maybe massaged the script a little bit and added some bigger ensemble scenes, but it very easily could have been a play with like 4 characters in it and one set.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Although we are leaving out one of the actors in this movie, and that's Miss Terry Garr. And I know you probably have some opinions on Terry Garr. I will say, I just read the greatest sentence. I was about an hour before we did this podcast. I was reading a review of Oh God, and Terry Garr, for people who don't know, wonderful, quirky, comedic actress. Ended up playing a lot of annoyed wives in movies because, actresses weren't really given a lot of lead roles back then. So she was always the annoyed, exasperated wife with a crazy husband, and this is kind of what her lot ended up being. But there's a great sentence that it says about this movie that he wrote: asking Terry Garr to play exasperated is like asking Luciano Pavarotti if maybe he'd like to sing something.
It's true. It's true. She really... Not enough is said about her performance in this role, and she has one of my favorite lines in the entire movie, which I guess we'll get to as we go through the story. But, we don't have the beats in at least the first hour of the movie are kind of the same thing over and over. It's like you have Jerry having God appear to him, and the first time God shows up for him, God invites him via a little typed message to come to an office building and sit down with him. And then progressively, Jerry keeps not really responding to it, and then God shows up again, and Jerry thinks maybe okay, but maybe not, and then God shows up again and again and again. And a lot of these beats really they have the same rhythm to them. Mm-hmm. And every time, the little coda on each one of those beats is Jerry goes home and Bobby is there to have him bounce the ideas off of her. And she says, well, this is going to ruin our lives. This is not great. I have to go along with it, but it's getting crazier and crazier. And every single time you have what makes those beats really work is having that coda on the end with someone else to play the ideas off of.
Yeah, in essence, she speaks for the audience. She is responding as the audience would respond to your husband coming home and saying, hey, I have to get on the news and talk about God. Talk to me today.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, are you a Terry Garr fan?
I wouldn't say I'm actively a Terry Garr fan, but I've enjoyed her in everything that I've seen her in.
Yeah, she's one of those I didn't really appreciate at the time in the 80s. And she was one of these people, when you look back in the 70s and 80s, she's in so many movies. You don't even realize how much stuff she was in. And it wasn't until I ended up, for people who don't know Terry Garr, you know what happened to her, right? Where she's afflicted with now?
Yeah, I had heard she's not in the greatest of health.
Yeah, she got multiple sclerosis. She has MS, very famous. She's written books about it. She had to retire from movies. So I've read a lot of her books. She's a wonderful writer. She's really naturally funny, and I've kind of followed her story. And it was only something I discovered recently is that in the 80s growing up, almost every girl I had a crush on or I thought was cute was basically some variant of Terry Garr in middle school or high school. And I didn't even realize that until much later. So it's so she was an oddly significant part of my life. And she's just one of those people, she just never really got to have a lead role. She's always the supporting actress. I know she got nominated for the movie Tootsie for supporting actress, and that's really about it. But it's just one of those things when you watch her more, you just realize how good she is at playing off other people.
Yeah, and she had guest spots on every single sitcom you can think of. And in fact, I think the one thing that comes to mind when I think of Terry Garr roles, and I think this kind of ages me a little bit, but I think of her 3-episode stint playing Phoebe's mother on Friends.
Yes. And that's when I didn't even realize how appropriate that role was, that she basically was the Lisa Kudrow of the 70s and 80s. And that was,
exactly.
Yeah, that was such a perfect thing. I didn't realize it at the time. So if people really want to see two actresses kind of passing the torch to one another, watch exactly what Jessica's talking about, those episodes of Friends.
Yeah, because you really, if you came of age in the 90s, you really couldn't get away from Friends.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing, before we move into the movie, I know we're kind of delaying this a bit, but Terry Garr, the all-time favorite guest of David Letterman on Late Night with David Letterman, where he visibly had a crush on her and he was just flirting with her, and she would flirt back, and they were some of the greatest interviews ever. If anybody wants to watch some good TV, go watch old clips of David Letterman and Terry Garr from the 80s.
I read an article about this fairly recently, and it checks out.
Okay, so let's dive into the movie. We're going to kind of summarize this first part real quick because all the important stuff I think happens at the end of the movie. But yeah, so basically John Denver plays a supermarket manager. He gets approached by God. One day he gets a little card in the mail, says God grants you an interview. And he just kind of brushes it off. He thinks it's just a prank. and then the next day at work he blows off the interview with God, and then he gets another card which is like shows up in a head of lettuce that he's preparing. So he's like, okay, well, this is real weird. Maybe I should actually show up and see what this is about. So he goes to this building in Los Angeles, and he goes up to this 27th floor, which he learns later does not exist. Somehow he's on this weird plane of a floor that doesn't exist, and it's an all-white room, and we just get the first of many great scenes with Jerry talking to God, and at this point we don't see God. God cannot present himself to Jerry because humans cannot really, they have no way to grasp what God looks like in their head. So it's just a voice over an intercom that God has selected. And so we just have George Burns talking to John Denver over an intercom. And it's one of the big standout scenes in the movie, I think.
Yeah, it's very simply done. And again, this one is very play-like. It's very theatrical. He's just sitting in an empty room, and all there is this intercom and a voice from offstage.
Yeah, something you could easily do in any stage production, and God starts talking with Jerry, and obviously Jerry doesn't believe him at first, but God proves it by making Jerry go outside, and Jerry realizes he's in a room that doesn't exist, on a floor that doesn't exist, in this all-white room. He's like, okay, maybe I should be listening to what this guy's saying, and he starts asking questions, and again, that's one of the little charms about this movie, that God is just kind of folksy, kind of like your grandpa, just telling stories. Like, there's no fire and brimstone. He's not scary. He's just saying stuff like, you know, some of the things he created in the world, things that he's proud of, things he's not proud of. Let's see, he's not proud of tobacco. He says that was one of his mistakes. And
avocados.
Avocados, yeah. God is very down on avocados because he made the pit too big. And again, just little folksy stuff that's kind of cute.
Yeah, it's very cute. And is it ostriches?
Ostriches, because they're silly-looking things. He's embarrassed by those.
Yep. And he gets into a few other admitted mistakes further on, which I think is part of what you are alluding to with it bordering on blasphemy.
Yeah, I mean, that is the thing with blasphemy, that there are some really hardcore religions that would say you're not really supposed to show God on the same level as a human or put God in a human form. So I'm really kind of shocked there wasn't much controversy over this movie. I'm reading about it now, and I don't see almost anything about it being controversial or people protesting it. So it must have been very well received. Did you read or heard anything about it being crossing lines or anything?
No, I've never heard of anybody having any kind of issue with it, which I think is also in part down to the 70s being a relatively hippy-dippy accepting time. I think that sort of ecumenical approach was a little more accepted. This was well before the rise of the religious right. They were kind of ascendant at this time, but it wasn't a mainstream thing to be offended about religion, weirdly enough. 70s were very easygoing in that regard, and I think he doesn't come out and say anything that's super controversial. Even this large organized church is being run by a profiteering, terrible person. That's really apparent and really true, and you can't really argue with it. And some of the biblical stuff, I mean, you look at it now and people tend to be very fervent about that sort of thing. And you think, well, why weren't people more upset? But the truth is, like, people didn't really get up on that soapbox about that sort of thing at the time.
Yeah, although I do wonder if there had been stuff like social media, then you'd kind of have these people being able to kind of coalesce and meet up and form opposition. Like, obviously, in the 70s, there's no social media, so anybody who might have had a problem with this wouldn't have been able to organize against it. So it would be interesting to see if a movie like this were to come out now. Actually, it would not be interesting. I don't want to see that.
Yeah, I really don't either. But it's also a good point that movies were a little more ephemeral in the 70s, too.
Mm-hmm.
Like, unless you were Star Wars, you pretty much were in the theater for as long as you ran. And P.S., oh God, actually knocked Star Wars out of the #1 spot for a week, which I thought was crazy. And crazy awesome. And you would be in the theater, and then you would go away until you ran on TV at some point. They didn't even have VCRs at the time, so you couldn't really embrace a movie, and it didn't have the same kind of staying power that movies today. You can watch pretty much anything you want at any time, and you're not beholden to whatever's in your theater that plays two things at once, or even whatever's in your video store. So I think really if a movie came out that offended everybody, like the people that were offended by it, there'd be a news article about it and they could get to be offended. And then the other people that were intrigued by the offensiveness would go see it in the theater and then it would go away and people would be offended by something else. And a movie like this now would just it would just mushroom, like the outcry about it and the backlash to the outcry and the backlash to the backlash to the outcry. It can get into kind of a feedback loop with social media. So that's also part of it, I think. And it's just like the cultural environment of the 70s, again, was very, very different. And that's not just because a character can believably be the assistant manager in a supermarket in a single income household and still have a pretty nice house in the suburbs.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up that Star Wars thing because that's interesting is that this movie not only was not offensive and didn't piss people off, it was so popular, this is the movie that knocked Star Wars out of number one. That's astounding.
Yeah, and nobody really knows about this movie today.
Yeah, why is that? I'm curious why that is because I was listening again on the DVD commentary where Terry Garr was talking about this movie was so big, it basically gave her a movie career. She's like, I was just a dancer. She danced with like Tony Basil and she did Young Frankenstein, but she never really did anything significant. And then she was in Oh God, and it gave her so much legitimacy as a Hollywood actor. She was in everything in the 80s. So it's like, this was a massive, massive movie, and it had two sequels that, well, not as big, or maybe three sequels. I kind of forget how many sequels there had, but like
I think there were just two.
They were fairly big hits too, and I will say that the only reason I knew Oh God as a kid is because I knew the second one first. I knew Oh God Book 2, which is about in the original John Denver gets approached by God. In the second one, it's about a little kid, a little girl gets approached by God to spread the word, and that's the one that I was super familiar with. It would be on TV all the time, so I knew that one, and then I eventually saw the original. But yeah, the sequels were fairly big deals too. So it really is odd that this movie is so forgotten these days.
It's not odd when you consider that there's not call for this kind of non-denominational faith-based discussion anymore. Like you either have to be the right kind of capital C Christian or you have to be the kind of person that keeps your faith under a bushel and doesn't really talk about it. And so that discussion doesn't happen, and so the kinds of things that facilitate that discussion don't happen.
That's an excellent point. That may be the best point anybody has ever made on Staff Pick, so congratulations.
All right. Cool.
All right, so let's go back to the movie here. So Jerry has been approached by God, and God says, well, you're going to be my messenger. I want you to spread the word. And Jerry's like, what message? And God's like, well, that I exist. I just want you to tell people that I actually do exist. There's too much, talk around the world these days that God is dead and God doesn't care. I just want people to know that I'm out there. And Jerry's like, well, why me? I'm not religious. And God's like, well, I'm not either, which I think is a funny line. And then,
I love that.
Yeah, God has a great line here. He says, religion is easy. I'm talking about faith. You're going to help me change that. And so that's the point of this movie here, that we just have to have faith. Like, the world was created for a reason, and God gave us all these tools and all these things that can help us. We're here to work together, and we're here to help one another. And God even says, and it's funny, this is how prescient this is, that he says this in 1977. God's like, well, I want you to tell people, you're ruining my environment. The skies look like mud. You're killing all my fishes. There's wars. Like, stop it. And it's really funny that you hear someone talking about that in 77, and it's like the world hasn't changed that much.
Well, it is this was like the first wave of ecology. Like, you get Earth Day in 1970, and you get the Crying Indian. And like, God is basically endorsing the Crying Indian at this point.
This is totally off subject, but I have to say this because you'll appreciate this. You just said this is when ecology started. One of my habits in real life is I love collecting old yearbooks from high schools from like way back in the 1900s. You find them at yard sales and on ebook. I have a yearbook from a high school in Michigan in 1906, and there's literally an essay in there about how we need to save the rainforest. In 1906, some kid wrote that essay.
Oh, wow.
Sorry, I just thought that was a nice little trivia note for ecology buffs out there.
Yeah, I'm a fan.
Yeah, so Jerry has been told, you're going to be my messenger. I need you to spread the word. And Jerry's like, but they'll put me away. They'll say I'm crazy. I'm just a man. What can I do? And God's like, well, Moses was just a man. Like, he wasn't anybody special. I just gave him a message. And what's he say here, that Jerry's like, well, you gave Moses tablets, you gave him the Ten Commandments, and God says, well, Moses had a bad memory, I had to write it down.
Yeah.
Again, just little folksy things that George Burns says that it's such a non-scary fire and brimstone God. He's just this dude that's set up. I know, blasphemy, I just called him just a dude, but just some guy that set up this world, and he just wants to see it work out, and he's this very hands-off God, and Jerry's questioning him, like, well, why do you allow suffering? Why do you allow bad things to happen? And God always has an answer. He's like, well, I gave you free will. That was one of my great inventions, that man has free will. Like, you can make it work, you can make it not work. It's really up to you. I'm not going to step in and stop things. And Jerry's like, well, why not? And so it gets into this whole theology of why God just doesn't make things happen, but that's the view of God in this world, that we're his creation. He's up there. He's rooting for us. He's going to pat us on the back and tell us good job. But in the end, it's up to us, and we need to make it work. And that's what he wants Jerry to tell the world.
Although he says he's not, he's a fan of a good miracle from time to time, like the 69 Mets.
Yes. Yeah, there's, three miracles that God will admit to in this movie. The 1969 Mets winning the World Series, the parting of the Red Sea, and then later in the movie he'll do a card trick. That's his other miracle.
Yep.
Okay, so Jerry goes home, and he's talking to his wife, and this is Terry Garr at her Terry Garriest, where he is telling her, I spoke to God today. And she's just rolling his eyes. She's like, what? It's like, you're not even religious. What? And then, she's the religious one, he's not. And then she gets into this argument with him where she says, well, I believe in God, Jerry. I just don't believe that he exists, which I think is a great line. But yeah, so Jerry is not 100% sure. He hasn't really bought into this, but God is going to keep coming back. And at one point he appears to him as a black woman in the store. Like, God can take different forms, and then God at one point appears to him in his car. And what eventually wins Jerry over is God makes it rain inside Jerry's car, which is a wonderful 1977 Pacer, one of the greatest cars ever.
Yeah, it very much brings to mind, I believe it was an AMC Gremlin in Wayne's World, but that's the kind of car it is.
It's funny, I was on the DVD commentary, the director Carl Reiner was talking about why they picked such a hideous car for this movie, and he said, well, it was very functional. We needed a scene where it rains in his car, so we wanted a car with a high roof where we could put the pipes, and that car had the highest roof of any car of its era, so they just picked it. So that is why it was immortalized in this movie, simply functional reasons.
Yeah, because you're basically sitting on the ground in that thing.
Okay, so Jerry is doubling down now. God keeps appearing to him, and God's getting kind of pissy. Not really an angry God. God's just kind of disappointed that Jerry's not really putting his full effort into getting this word out. And then, let's see here, God appears to him in the shower. This is a great scene where Jerry's taking a shower one day and God just appears to him. And this is where we first see him as George Burns, where previously God said you couldn't accept my real form, but now he's this little old dude in a fishing cap, which I know you said if you could choose the ideal religion, it would be an old guy walking around in a fishing cap.
Well, I guess, it's non-threatening. It's kind of whimsical. I see the point. I would love to know what they said on the DVD commentary track about the fishing cap, though.
I don't remember the fishing cap coming up. Maybe I can write to Carl Reiner and I can satisfy. I know he's still around. He's like 90.
Is he on Twitter?
He is on Twitter. Let's tweet him after this and ask about why the fishing cap.
Yep, and that's all we should say is, why the fishing cap?
So God appears to Jerry in the shower, and Jerry's all covering up, like, ah! And God's like, what, you don't think I know what you got? It's hard to say if this movie is a comedy or a drama. It's kind of that very 70s gentle where it straddles the line of both. But there are a couple of genuine laughs, and that's one that I always get. Just the way George Burns delivers some of these lines, and I know on the commentary Carl Reiner was talking about what makes George Burns so special as an actor, especially in this movie, is that he delivers a joke as if he's telling the truth. And that's the thing. He's not winking to the audience. It's very folksy. He just says it matter of fact, and it's usually a quick, pithy observation. It's very, very charming to come out of God's mouth.
Yeah, and then the ensuing explanation about how making clothes was a mistake because then you have pockets. If you have pockets, you got to put something in them. It all comes from a very honest place, yeah, even though it's kind of absurd.
Okay, and here is really the big point of this movie, the big picture that they kind of develop this whole theology around, where at one point we're in the shower and Jerry's really questioning God on why he doesn't stop in and make the world molded in a certain way. And Jerry says, don't you care? Like, people die, like there's wars, there's famine. Don't you care? And God says, of course I do. I care plenty. But what can I do? I only care about the big picture. I don't get into the details.
Yeah, that's marginally blasphemous.
But again, it's very, again, for an atheist like me, I don't really, I mean, I say I'm an atheist, but it's not like a conscious decision. I just kind of just gave up on religion. I just didn't really buy it after a while. But like, that's such a neat way to kind of view the world. Like, if there were intelligent design and there was a creator and stuff and it all was passed down, like, I like that. It's up to us. Like, there is free will. You can do whatever you want, which I find that just a very appealing way to look at religion, to the point that I watch this movie and it almost makes me want to be religious.
It kind of borders on deism when you think about it. The
Mm-hmm.
idea that there's a creator God that doesn't really concern himself that much with the day-to-day goings-on of the world. And yeah, it's a little more appealing than, I wouldn't say I consider myself a hardline atheist either. And you think, well, if that's how things were, like that's very palatable. Like, that's a kind of faith you can get behind.
Mm-hmm. And there's one more line here that I love, where we learn that God is a huge slacker, where Jerry challenges him on some of the more, biblical traditions. Like, I don't believe them. And Jerry's like, I don't believe that you created the world in 6 days and then rested on the seventh. And God's like, well, you're right, I didn't. And Jerry's like, what? That's true? And God's like, yeah, to tell you the truth, I thought about it for 5 days and then did it all in 1 day. He's like, I work better under pressure.
And so he basically, he was like me in college.
Yeah, basically. When I think of God, I basically think of you.
Well, I get that a lot.
Yeah, so God is a huge procrastinator. So that's the one bit of theology to come out of this movie, that he cares, but he's hands off, and he's a huge procrastinator.
Yep, that sounds about right. Makes him more relatable.
Exactly. He like we talked before we went on the air, he's basically just like your grandpa, just walking around in his fishing cap, giving out life advice. Just, you want to hang out with him and go for a drive and just talk to the guy.
Yep. Although I don't know if I want to go for a drive with him, because he might make it rain in the car.
That's true. Just don't get a pacer. Get something with low roof so they can't put the pipes in there.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. Although I would imagine that not being in a pacer was probably already on your life's goals.
Yeah, I definitely, that's a bucket list item.
Okay, so from here on out, Jerry is hardcore into the God thing. God has convinced him, so he goes to the newspaper, and he gets put on the back page, and he ends up, let's see, what does he do? He goes to the LA Times, he has to sit down and talk with his kids, he ends up on TV, and then at one point he ends up on the Dinah Shore show, which, for people who don't know, Dinah Shore was a big talk show, former actress. She had a talk show, and it was very famous in the 70s, so he's on there. And then once he's on the talk show, all hell breaks loose, that all these religious wackos and like the Hare Krishnas and stuff are showing up at his house thinking he's the next savior. And Jerry's wife, of course, Terry Garr, is just going insane. And what is the one line? The garbage? This is the line.
Yeah,
I think
this might be my favorite. This might be my favorite one in the whole movie. I went to take the garbage out, and two people blessed me. One of them blessed the garbage.
Yeah. Yeah, Terry, anytime she gets to open her mouth, she's going to steal the scene, because Terry's just horrified. Yeah, they have to take the kids to school with like a private guard. Like, it's just, and she's like, is this worth it, Jerry? Like, is God really going to permit our lives to be ruined because of this stupid stunt you pulled? But Jerry knows that he's telling the truth. Oh yeah, and then God has a great quote here which kind of backs up Jerry's belief, where God says, Jerry, you have the strength that comes from knowing. Like, you know you're telling the truth, even though everyone thinks you're crazy. And Jerry's life is slowly spiraling down and down. And it's really going to culminate in this thing where he's called in front of the university. There's like a college nearby him, and they have a theology department run by this guy, a reverend. What is his name? Reverend Williams?
Willie Williams. Yeah.
Played by the wonderful actor Paul Sorvino, who people may know as the father of Mira Sorvino. And they called Jerry in, and they basically call BS on his thing. You did not see God. Stop spreading the word. And they're just, these are kind of the villains. There's not really a villain in the movie, but these would be the ones where these hardcore religious scholars just call BS on him and say, prove that you talked to God. And Jerry says, well, I can't really prove it. And they said, yes, we know, and that's why we're going to debunk you, and we're going to flat out state that you did not talk to God. And they said, but we'll give you one chance. We'll present you with these these questions. And so they give him like a questionnaire that he is supposed to present to God, that only God would know the answer to these questions. And this is probably the funniest scene in the movie, where they lock him in a room and God is going to show up and bail Jerry out by answering what is basically, as God says, a history final.
Yeah. And these guys are basically, they're all sitting around a long table and like sort of ethnically diverse. They look like the specter of religious panels.
Yes, they do. All the religions of the world are gathered, and they are going to quiz, and they give Jerry the quiz. And, of course, to make it even harder, they make it so Jerry can't answer the questions himself. They're all written in the ancient language of Aramaic, which I don't think we've seen since an Indiana Jones movie, the last time we saw a good Aramaic scene in a movie.
Yeah, I love that Aramaic is always the go-to.
The Aramaic lobby is strong in Hollywood.
Yeah, well, just ask Mel Gibson.
Very good. Okay, so Jerry's been locked in a hotel room by this theology department. He's supposed to answer all these questions, and so God shows up, and God's like, oh, look, they put him in Aramaic. Cute, very cute. And so God starts sitting down and answering these questions, and this is, again, one of the big signature scenes in this movie where we hear a lot about the theology of this movie and the theology of God, what he thinks about things, and they ask him, like, questions about Judgment Day and Adam and Eve, and he has a really good explanation for Adam and Eve. It was about how he thought they were in middle age. It was something like that.
Yeah, he made them too young, and they had a lot of life in front of them, and he realized they were just teenagers, and that his mistake was not bringing people with a little more wisdom and age.
Oh yeah, and also he thought life expectancy would be like 30.
Yeah.
So he thought Adam and Eve would be middle-aged, so they'd be representative of the people. That was it, and they're too young. They don't have enough life experience or something.
Right. And then kids, he doesn't say that young people are a mistake because kids are one of his greatest inventions, but he would have done that differently.
Yeah, and then there's a quote in there where the theology department asks, are you the father of Jesus? Is Jesus your son? And God says, well, yeah, Jesus is my son. So is Muhammad. So is Buddha. Everyone, you're my son. Everyone's my son. There is no one true religion. We're all just here, and we have to work together. And then another great George Burns quote, and this is the one that I always think of when I think of this movie. God says, I think Voltaire had me right. He said I was a comedian playing to an audience that was afraid to laugh.
Yeah, which is pretty much exactly how he's playing this role.
Yes. And so God answers all these questions in Aramaic about the history of the universe, all the great mysteries of life, and he says, take this to that reverend guy, this Paul Sorvino. Take this to the reverend who's out there conning all these people, and give him these answers, and say, God says he's a phony. Tell him that. Say, if he wants to get rich, fine, but tell him I told him to shut up. So Jerry's going to get in trouble here because he's going to walk into the most famous preacher basically of his era and call him a fraud in front of everybody in all his congregation. And what's going to happen is Jerry will be hauled into court at the end of the movie for
slander.
Slander, yes, because he slandered a very famous televangelist. And this is kind of the wrap-up of this movie where Jerry will have to prove once and for all he really did talk to God, or he's going to be sued and lose everything that he's worked for all these years.
Did you notice that nobody actually ever looks at the answers?
I didn't notice that. No. So God spends all these times answering the history final and nobody looks?
Yeah, nobody grades his paper.
So I guess that's very fitting for this movie that all these, hardcore, organized religious people have the answers to the universe in front of them and they don't care. They would just rather, keep up with the charade that they're gathering money to save in God's name.
Yes, I think that's exactly the point.
That's good. I actually did not notice that, but that's very funny.
Yeah, in fact, I watched to see if I could see what actually happens to the papers. Like, he brings them up on stage to Reverend Williams, and then he kind of puts them in Reverend Williams' face, but I don't think he, throws them away or anything. They just kind of drag Jerry off stage, and it's never revealed if anybody actually ever read any of it.
So all the answers to the mysteries of the universe have been shoved in a drawer somewhere and will be discovered in 100 years.
Pretty much, yeah.
Right, so there you go. That is the overlying message of this movie, that religion doesn't really care about the actual answers. They're more interested in pulling in the money.
Yeah, or getting their message out. I don't think God specifically says it's about money. He says it's really about them pushing their own agenda, which frequently is money, but frequently it's other things too.
Absolutely. Okay, so now we get the big wrap up of this movie, the final scene where Jerry's in court, and this is Terry Garr again just being exasperated and fed up that they're about to lose all these years of assistant managing at the food mart that he has built up. It's funny watching these old movies that the career goals are generally a little they're aiming a little lower than you would see in like an 80s or 90s movie where everyone's like a hotshot lawyer or something, like a Tom Cruise movie. In this one, he just wants to make manager at the supermarket. So it's interesting when I watch these 70s movies how much more I would say more realistic to like the slice of life that I remember living, but I'm not sure if that's the right word, but it's more middle class than movies tend to be in later years.
Well, yeah, exactly. Like he's not well off by any means, and you can tell they struggle with money, but it's also he's relatively comfortable in his assistant manager role at the supermarket, and that feels very 70s to me.
Assistant to the manager, right?
Yes, assistant to the manager.
Okay, so yeah, Jerry's in court and he has nothing to back up his claims. He's being called to testify. He has nothing to back up that he actually talked to God, but although, again, he knows he has the strength that comes from knowing. And then this is, again, the scene. You'll see this on YouTube. You can go Google it if you want to watch a scene from this movie, that this scene is represented several times on YouTube, where George Burns just appears in the courtroom, and this is the first time he has really revealed himself to everybody, and he's going to come in there and basically save Jerry's butt by just laying the smack down on everybody, and this is an awesome George Burns moment here.
Yeah, although the point immediately prior to him appearing in the courtroom where Jerry says that, he calls on God to come in, and everybody sits there expectantly for a minute, and he says, aha, you all expected something would happen, so doesn't that leave enough reasonable doubt? Mm-hmm. I thought that was a really clever moment as well, especially when you pair it with the panel of religious experts. Like, they also have that moment of anticipation, because if they didn't, they wouldn't give him a whole list of questions to answer.
That's true. Yeah, they do leave the door open that maybe he's telling the truth, and that it's a very, like you said, a very smart screenplay. It's clearly written by people who know how stories work and screenplays work, and it's not a surprise when you know Carl Reiner was behind this, and he was in charge of like the Dick Van Dyke Show and like every Steve Martin movie. Like Carl Reiner, a big shot writer and director, so he had his hand in this, and he had other comedy writers in there. So yeah, it's a very intelligent screenplay. And then again, George Burns kind of shows up at the end, and there's the great line where he gets sworn in as a witness, and they say, "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, so help you God?" And George says, "Yes, so help me."
Yeah.
Judge is like, what? So it's kind of like a little My Cousin Vinny here, where the judge just does not believe that he's God. And then this is where George Burns just charms everyone, that he just basically lays the smack down. I sent you a messenger. I'm telling you that, I exist and that everything can work out. Why is this so hard for you to believe? And again, God actually gets kind of pissy here, where he says, why is it so hard that people can believe the devil exists? You just had that movie, and he references The Exorcist. He says that movie was a huge hit. Everyone bought it. Why was that so easy to believe that no one can believe that I'm here? So he kind of gets annoyed that he sent this messenger and no one bought into it. And then at one point he says he's going to do a miracle, even though he's not a miracle guy, but he will do one to prove that he's God. And he chooses a card trick, which I think is wonderful.
Yeah, it's pretty wonderful, like the way he's got the patter down, and he's like, oh, there aren't any cards? Well, look again, and poof, and it's all very silly, I think.
Yeah, it's very light, but again, it's an image of God that I think would appeal to many people, even if you're religious, if you're non-religious, and I would guess most of my listeners have not seen this movie, heard of this movie, anything. I would advise you to kind of watch this one. It's such and I keep saying appealing and gentle. I don't know any more words that are more appropriate than that. Yeah. It's just a very appealing view of what you would like God to be like. And even God kind of says here at the end of the movie, after he bails Jerry out, he proves he exists, and he disappears from the courtroom. He kind of walks out and he disappears. He says, I just want everyone to have faith. Try not to hurt each other. We've had enough of that. No matter how scary it is, no matter how scary it gets, it can work. You might not believe in me, but I believe in you.
Yeah, that's very feel-good 70s. Like, that's straight out of Free to Be You and Me.
It is, but again, it's corny, but it's like, like I kind of miss that corniness in movies. You don't everything's so cynical and like fast paced and just slick these days in movies. This movie is like the exact opposite of that. Would you kind of say?
Yeah, I would say this is. I mean the thing that I like about it is how earnest it is.
Mm-hmm.
Like everything they're trying to do, they're actually making a visible effort to bring it to you and not acting like they're kind of above it or that it never talks down to you, it never condescends, which is a very rare thing in a movie these days.
Yeah, it really does treat the audience with respect and dignity. And that's why I just can't say enough about it. And I always say, again, this is not a movie that people would expect me to like, because I'm usually either horror movies or comedy movies. And this one, it's billed as a comedy, but it's not. It's just a sweet little movie that makes you feel good about yourself and makes you feel positive about life and the human race. And again, even if you're not religious, it makes you feel like you want to go out and make a difference in the world. I want to go be nice to people. I want to make a difference. I just want to make things work out. We're all here to help each other. That's the whole point of life. And when, in fact, at one point they even ask God, I think one of the questions is, what's the meaning of life? And God says, well, the meaning is whatever you think it is. Like, there is no meaning. It's whatever you make of it. And which I think is a very humanistic way to look at. That's like a humanistic psychology, that you control your own destiny and it's really, you have control over it.
Yeah, or it's like the end of Back to the Future Part 3 when Doc Brown says the future hasn't been written yet. It's whatever you make it.
Absolutely. And then, yeah, at the end of the movie, so Jerry basically gets cleared of all the charges of slander, and because the judge can't prove that God was there, they can't prove that God wasn't there. All the court transcript doesn't have God's recorded voice on it. All the things they typed that he said don't show up. So everyone's kind of flabbergasted what happened. They throw out the charges. And basically God says goodbye to Jerry at the end of the movie. He says basically, or Jerry's like, did we win? Did we fail? Did we succeed? And God's like, well, you're basically Johnny Appleseed. You went out there and you planted some seeds, and maybe some good will come out of it. People will have faith and they'll do good deeds. And so you're kind of like my Joan of Arc here. You were my Moses. You started the movement, and it's all going to go from here. And Jerry says, well, thanks, God. Am I ever going to see you again? And God says, nah, you don't need. I'm going to go on a safari or something. God is going to go hang out with animals for a while, and then Jerry says, can I talk to you? And God says, well, how about this? You talk, I'll listen. Which I just think is a really neat thing that for people, I don't really believe in prayer, but I know many people do, but it's just a very nice thing to think that if when you are praying, when you're talking to a higher power, that maybe he's not talking back, but maybe he is listening. And I think it's very comforting to people. Yeah,
and I think it does leave the viewer feeling very cared about.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's a good point. That's a good word. I was trying to think how I was going to sum up this movie. You walk out of it feeling like you feel cared about, and I think that's wonderful.
Yeah. And it seems like the movie wants you to feel that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it doesn't talk down to you. It doesn't condescend to you. It doesn't beat you over the head with slapstick, puns, jokes. It just feels like a movie. Someone believed in the story. They wrote it with very thoughtful, intelligent dialogue, and they believed in you and they wanted you to believe in the movie, and it just you come out of it feeling like everybody respected one another in this whole process. And again, when you read reviews of this or behind the scenes stuff, like they all loved Carl Reiner, the director. Everybody loved Terry Garr. I think Carl Reiner even says in the commentary, Terry Garr, you were the perfect choice for this because like every director and producer in Hollywood had a crush on you. They loved you. You were like their favorite, which sounds creepy maybe now in the modern era. But at the time, I think it was meant as a very gentle compliment. But yeah, like George Burns, I think, read that he went into this movie not wanting to act. He didn't really want to work with John Denver, but he went to a concert and he saw how talented John Denver was, and he really became a fan. He really liked working with him. And I'd read that Terry Garr was the same thing. She was this stage actor at the time, and they were trying to lure her into a movie, and she didn't want to do it. And she's like, I don't want to work with John Denver. He's nobody. I'm a trained Broadway actor. I don't work with singers. And like she just came to love him. And I remember in her book she writes about what a gentle, nice, kind soul he was, and how just this whole movie just screams respect. Everyone just had a good time and respected one another.
Yeah, well, and is it really possible to hate John Denver? Like, the only people I know that have ever said I hate John Denver are people that are trying to be edgy and subversive. And if you are edgy and subversive and you run smack into this movie, it doesn't work. You just get like rejected back out of it,
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you think someone comes in hard and edgy and just hates John Denver and just loves snark, and they run into this movie? Do you think it's possible to hate this movie? Like, you and I are two of the snarkiest people I would say I know, yet we were completely won over by this movie. I cannot say anything bad about this movie. I'm just wondering if it's possible for someone to absolutely bounce up against this movie and hate it or just reject it.
Well, I can think of, and there's another movie that's kind of the same, it didn't occur to me until I was reading some of the contemporary reviews of the movie. It was compared a lot to Frank Capra's works, specifically It's a Wonderful Life, which is another movie that is so earnest and appealing and comes away with such a great message that I have a hard time fathoming why people hate it, and yet many, many people I know hate it. And the reason cited for why people hate It's a Wonderful Life is overexposure. So I could see someone feeling the same way about Oh God if it was something that they caught on the Encore channel a million times when they were a kid and they just kind of got overloaded with it. But I can't see someone coming into this once and coming away from it with a negative opinion.
Yeah, no, I do think that probably is correct, that in a way this movie was helped by the fact that it is kind of obscure, and maybe I'm underselling it. Maybe a lot of people know about it, but it's one of those, like, you can barely find reviews written of it on the Internet Movie Database. I think there's only 5 that they have linked to. Like, it's one of these, it doesn't have much of a presence. So, yeah, if they were to run this movie on Christmas every year, if it was a family tradition, I could see people getting sick of it. But again, that's not the case. So it's one that I really would hope a couple of my listeners, or maybe a lot of my listeners, go out there and give this movie a chance, try to track it down, because the feeling you get coming out of this movie is not what you're used to. It's a whole different type of relationship between movie and audience, and I think it's something it's just kind of neat, because that doesn't exist very much in the world anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I would liken it to if you didn't get It's a Wonderful Life shoved down your throat every year and you still look forward to it being on NBC on Christmas Eve. It's the same feeling when you finish watching It's a Wonderful Life on NBC on Christmas Eve. But you can watch it any time of year because it's not seasonal.
Okay, so with Oh God again, Oh God, huge hit, came out, gave John Denver an odd acting career all of a sudden. It really gave George Burns a second acting career, because I know, again, he won an Oscar for Sunshine Boys, but this is the movie that people really remember him for because he became God. Although I would argue there's another movie right there, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, that he had the misfortune of showing up. Have you seen that?
When are you going to do staff picks about that one?
Yeah. I'm not sure that I drink enough to be able to have the confidence to do that one. You've seen that one movie, correct?
Oh, yeah, I have seen that one.
Yeah, that's, for people who don't know, they made a musical out of the Beatles in the late 70s, and it's the worst possible combination of bad covers of Beatles songs. It's got the Bee Gees, it's got disco. They cram way too many songs in it. Like, it's just horribly written, acted, everything. And then George Burns has the misfortune of being the narrator, where he has to sing Fixing a Hole by the Beatles, which is a really poor combination of singer for song. And we'll just forget that George Burns was involved in that. Just think of him as the Oh God guy, and it makes more sense.
Yeah, it definitely, I kind of block out the entire existence of that film. But it is one of the most 70s things to ever 70s.
I will say a bit of trivia. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was the first movie I ever saw on VHS. That was my introduction to the world of home video. So it was all uphill from there.
Yeah, well, I guess there are worse places to start.
Oh yeah, so Oh God, big movie. It gave Terry Garr a career. It gave Carl Reiner, loved it. It was just a big hit, and then they made the 2 sequels. You said you watched the other sequels. Are you familiar with them off the top of your head, or would you have to watch them again?
Oh God Book 2 I would definitely have to watch again, because something about that little girl when I was about that age, like, just grated on me. Like, she's not the most nuanced of child actors.
I was just reading about her. Her name, do you know about her? Her name is Luann, and she was a very famous stage actress. She was Annie on Broadway. And so she kind of brings that over-the-top Annie, I would say almost like Vanessa Bayer on SNL, those child actors.
Yes.
That enthusiasm to the role. So yeah, I saw Oh God Book 2 many, many, many times when I was a kid, and I have not gone back to it, because I do remember her being a little over the top, perhaps.
Yeah, just a smidge. The one scene I remember from that is she's in a sidecar on a motorcycle and God is driving the motorcycle and she gets pulled over because they don't see anybody driving the motorcycle and they ask her who's driving and she says God is.
Well, there you go. God was her literal co-pilot there.
Exactly. There, I see what you did there.
Yes. Although
Yeah.
George Burns was like 100 by that point, so I'm not sure he should have been driving anything.
Yeah, no kidding. But he made it just to 100
He
when
did?
he passed away. He was like, and I remember a lot of his act was revolved around like he was going to make it to 100, and sure enough, that's exactly where he was when he passed away.
Now, the third God movie, or were there three or four?
There were three,
Okay.
and the third one is the other one that I saw that one many, many, many times, and part of it was because I could rent it. I think it was the only Oh God movie that I could actually rent from the local video store, and so I did several times. The premise of that one is not that God comes to somebody; it's that the devil comes to a man, played by Ted Wass, who was the father on Blossom, and it's a very mid-'80s cast of people that you wouldn't remember unless you watched a lot of sitcoms in the '80s. So then the devil comes in the form of George Burns and makes him sign this contract. He's a struggling musician, and he says, I'll make you famous. And he makes him famous, but then he makes him into a rock star who is not him. And he takes on this other man's identity, and it's very wrenching because he has a wife and an unborn child, and he has to figure out how to get out of the contract, and so, of course, calls on God. And I remember the line where he runs into a street preacher who says, to find God, you have to go to the desert. And so he goes to Las Vegas, and he pages God in the hotel. And then God wins his soul back in a poker game with the devil.
This sounds very convoluted. That is a far more significant, complicated story than the original.
Yeah, it turns out that this was a screenplay that somebody else wrote, and it was sitting on a shelf for a long time, and then when this Oh God thing got legs and started to be a franchise, they dusted off this screenplay and kind of wrote George Burns' voice into the characters. And yeah, it's entertaining, and it's one of those like sort of very simplified how you would like the world to work portrayals of faith, and I remember really enjoying it as a child, but I'm sure it doesn't hold up quite as well anymore. I think it did kind of convey that same sort of sentimentality, but of course, by necessity, when your main character is the devil, it does get a little darker.
And I have heard, I have not seen that one. I just heard it's the law of diminishing returns, that if people who like the first one say, well, the second one was okay, the third one gets kind of corny and campy, but again, although I am curious about something you said. You said it was the only one you were able to rent in the video store?
Yeah, and I think that was just like the weird selection in the video store. Like they kind of rotated stuff out over time, and so they didn't have the first two Oh God movies, but this one was still relatively recent, I guess.
Okay, I was going to say, yeah, was Oh God Book 2 always rented? Was that the problem? Was it too popular in your area?
There was some kid in my hometown who was obsessed with Oh God Book 2.
It might have been me. So I may have grown up near. You may have heard the legend of me. I may have lived in New York or wherever. Oh wait, you were from Montana, right?
I was from Montana.
Okay,
yeah.
So maybe you heard about me in Spokane as the Oh God Book 2 kid.
Yeah, maybe the video just wound up in Spokane, and that was the problem. But Oh God, You Devil came out in 1984, so right around like 1988, 89, when I would have been renting it, it was probably still recent enough that the video store felt it was a new release.
Okay, before we sign off here, there's two last things I have to say. One is that Donald Pleasance is in this movie, and it's hilarious because he gets fourth billing, and he has two lines in the entire movie. He's in one scene. And I don't know why he gets fourth billing, but he had a hell of an agent.
Well, he was famous.
And this was before Halloween, so he hadn't even played Dr. Loomis yet.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess, I mean, he's known. I've heard the name.
He was a Bond villain. He was Blofeld.
Oh, yeah, he was Blofeld. Right.
And the other thing is that I remember reading some trivia about this. Now I wanted to end with this, that all this whole podcast we've talked about how awesome George Burns is and how he rocks and how he owns this role and how nobody could play this role, maybe aside from Morgan Freeman, but that's a whole different argument. But I remember reading stories of the making of this movie, how disinterested he was in sticking around and acting. how literally every scene was everyone else blocking and doing their lines, and George Burns standing around and saying, "Can we hurry up? I got a card game I got to get to." So that's the thing. He's so good in this movie, yet he phones it in completely. Yet he's that good that he could pull it off.
Yeah, well, it's such an effortless performance. And I guess it was an effortless performance because he didn't really give a lot of thought to it.
Yeah. So anyway, that is our coverage of Oh God. Do you have, Jessica, anything else you'd like to add about this wonderfully underrated and forgotten movie before we sign off and continue to not go to church?
I really just want to encourage people to track this down. It's not hard to find. For all of the complaining we did that it's not in wide circulation, it's relatively easy to track down, and it's really quite sweet and straightforward, and I don't think you'll feel like it was time wasted. If you already wasted an hour of your life listening to us talk about a movie you haven't seen, go the extra mile, reserve another 2 hours and go watch this movie, because I think and if you have seen it and it's been a while, go watch it again, because I think the experience is much different as an adult.
Yeah, absolutely. This is one I'm so proud that I got to talk about on Staff Picks, because again, the comedies are kind of easy. We just get on here and we pick out our favorite laugh parts and laugh about them. And in the horror movies, we explain why it was scary. Talking about dramas is a whole different thing. And again, I know this is technically a comedy, but I would say it's more of a drama because it's so thoughtful and stuff. But so I'm always pleased when I get to talk about a drama, and I think we can actually make it interesting to listeners to hear about it, because dramas inherently are a harder sell than like the more fantastical movies. So again, I just want to thank you, Jessica, for stopping by, and I want to thank all my listeners again, everyone, for giving this new podcast a chance. Hopefully you will get a chance to find Oh God, give it a listen, and realize and learn why people loved George Burns so much, how he was one of the most beloved entertainers of his era. And again, even after his career ended, this was his second career as an actor, and he became beloved there too. So again, if you want to reach me, if you have any feedback on this podcast, you can reach me at staffpickspodcast@gmail.com. You can reach me on Twitter at Mario J. Lanza. And until the next time I talk to you, I will be out looking for more underrated and underloved movies. And the next one's going to be fun. I have a very, very, very obscure horror movie coming up later in the week called Tourist Trap, which I can guarantee most people have never seen, but I love talking about it. So I will talk to you guys later. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.
If you wanted to see me, why didn't you just appear over my bed?
Hollywood. Next question.